The dining room smells like roasted duck and expensive wine. There are 40 men at this table, and every one of them has a reason to want the man at the head of it dead. They've watched him burn through generals the way other men burn through candles, bright for a moment, then snuffed without ceremony. They've seen what happens when you disagree too loudly, when you retreat too far, when glory arrives a day late. The man at the head of this table does not forgive. He does not forgive, and he has on more than one occasion exiled men to the frozen edge of Russia for the crime of being wrong once. But tonight, one of the men seated here betrayed him on a battlefield 4 hours ago, opened a flank, let an army through, changed the course of a war that had seemed, until this morning, unlosable, and Napoleon Bonaparte is looking directly at him and smiling. Welcome back to Echoes of History. If your mind is restless tonight and the dart feels a little too loud, I'm glad you found your way here. This channel exists for exactly this kind of hour. If you haven't subscribed yet, it takes 2 seconds and means there's always something waiting the next time sleep won't come. Drop a comment before you drift. Tell me where you are and what time it is. There's something I love about knowing who's out there in the dark. Here's where we're going tonight. The story of a man who betrayed the most powerful military mind in European history on the day that mattered most, and then sat across from him at dinner. And the reason Napoleon let him, the reason Napoleon smiled, that reason is the most unsettling part of the whole story, because it has nothing to do with mercy. Here's what most people believe about Napoleon's generals. They believe they were loyalists, devoted, grateful men who had been lifted from obscurity by a short Corsican with an impossible vision, and who repaid that elevation with something close to worship. The myth of Napoleon's marshals is the myth of the band of brothers, rough men made magnificent by a leader who saw in them what no one else had. Ney the bravest, Murat the most dazzling, Davout the most reliable, soldiers forged in the same revolutionary fire as the man who commanded them. That's the version that gets painted. Literally, you've seen those paintings. Men on rearing horses, capes flying, faces lit with the particular glow of people who believe they are on the right side of destiny. But here's what nobody tells you about Napoleon's inner circle. By 1813, more than half of his most senior commanders were, in various degrees, exhausted, resentful, physically broken, or quietly hoping the whole thing would end. 13 years of continuous warfare does something to a man. It does something to his knees, his back, his capacity for the kind of absolute faith that gets you killed for someone else's ambition. The loyalty had been real once. By the end, for some of them, it was performance. And one man, one marshal in particular, had decided at a very specific moment, on a very specific morning, that it was time the performance ended. His name was Auguste de Marmont, and what he did on the 12th of April 1814 would follow him for the rest of his life like a shadow with teeth. To understand what Marmont did, you need to understand what the spring of 1814 actually felt like from inside the French command. Napoleon has been retreating for more than a year. The catastrophe of Russia, 700,000 men marching east, fewer than 100,000 staggering back, has broken something that cannot be repaired by even the most brilliant tactical mind in European history. The coalition forces are inside France now. Paris has fallen. The Emperor is fighting a campaign so geometrically perfect, so tactically astonishing, that military historians still study it, and he is losing it, because there are simply not enough men left to make genius matter. It is April. It is cold. The marshals are meeting, and they have come, several of them together, to tell the Emperor something he does not want to hear. It is over. Abdicate. Save what can be saved. Napoleon rages. Napoleon bargains. Napoleon proposes a march on Paris that the marshals, one by one, refuse to support. And in that room, in that refusal, something shifts permanently. The marshals have not betrayed him yet. Not technically. They've simply refused a suicidal order. There is a difference in military law between declining an impossible command and opening your flank to the enemy. Marmont is in that room. Marmont, who has known Napoleon since they were both young officers, since before anyone knew the name Bonaparte. Marmont, who was at the siege of Toulon. Marmont, who was at Egypt. Toulon. Marmont, whose entire career is a monument built on Napoleon's shadow. And on the night of April 12th, while Napoleon is still refusing to accept reality, Marmont makes a decision. He negotiates privately with the Austrian forces. He agrees to march his corps, 6,000 men, the 6th Corps, one of the last organized military units Napoleon has left, away from the French defensive line and into Austrian custody, not in battle, not under fire. In the dark, quietly, a withdrawal that looks from a distance like a repositioning and is, in fact, a surrender. When Napoleon learns what has happened, the word that comes back in every contemporary account is the same. He doesn't shout, he goes quiet, and in French, in a register that his secretary describes as almost inaudible, he says something that translates roughly as, "Marmont has just killed me. 6,000 men." That was the margin. 6,000 men repositioned in the night, and the last viable strategy for holding the coalition back collapses like a table with one leg removed. Napoleon abdicates the next day. Now here's the layer that nobody leads with: the dinner, the handshake, what actually happened after. Because here's what the history books skim past. Napoleon and Marmont met again, not years later, not in some distant symbolic reconciliation, within days of the abdication, within the strange suspended formality of Fontainebleau, where the emperor is still technically the emperor and his court is still technically a court while the terms of his exile are being negotiated. They are in the same rooms, they are at the same tables. And Napoleon, who has just said that this man killed him, who has watched 6,000 of his last soldiers walk away into the dark, does not have Marmont arrested, does not have him shot, does not erupt in the volcanic rage that everyone who knew him expected. He shakes his hand. Think about that for a second. Not as a piece of military history, as a human moment. A man looks at the person who destroyed the last thing he had and extends his hand and smiles. Why? Here is the answer that the simple version of the story offers. Napoleon was being strategic, magnanimous, controlling the narrative of his own defeat by refusing to appear broken. That's probably part of it. Napoleon was always performing, even in private, perhaps especially in private. But here's the reframe. Napoleon, in conversations at Fontainebleau that were recorded by multiple witnesses, said something that clarifies everything. He said in various formulations that he had always known it would end this way, not with Marmont specifically, but with someone, that the structure of what he had built required eventually the kind of exhaustion that produces exactly this kind of act, that you cannot ask men to be superhuman for 13 years and then be surprised when they become merely human at the worst possible moment. He wasn't forgiving Marmont, he was placing him in a category he had apparently always known existed, the category of the inevitable. And here is the strange dimension, the part that turns this from a military history story into something that sits differently in the chest. Marmont lived until 1852. He outlived Napoleon by 31 years. He outlived the Empire, the Restoration, the July Monarchy, the Revolution of 1848. He lived long enough to watch France cycle through more governments than most countries manage in a century. He wrote his memoirs. He travelled. He attended dinners and receptions in European capitals where people knew his name and what it meant. In French, to this day, the word for betrayal, one specific flavour of betrayal, the kind that comes from someone trusted, someone inside, is Raguisade. It comes from Marmont's title, the Duke of Ragusa, 3 decades after his death. The language itself had absorbed what he did. He didn't just betray Napoleon. He became the word for it. How do you live with being a word? How do you sit at a dinner table in Vienna in 1840, knowing that in Paris, at that exact moment, someone is using your name to describe the worst thing one person can do to another? His memoirs are, by multiple historical accounts, a document of extraordinary defensiveness. He spends hundreds of pages explaining, contextualizing, reframing. He was trying to end a war that couldn't be won. He was protecting his men. He was acting in France's best interest, not Napoleon's. And France and Napoleon were no longer the same thing. Some of it is even arguably true. But the word stayed. The word is still there. Here's the mirror, the thing this story is actually about, underneath all the eagles and empires. Every person alive has at some point made a Marmont decision. Not at this scale, not with 6,000 soldiers and the fate of Europe in the balance. But the structure is identical. The moment when loyalty to a person and loyalty to your own survival, your own judgment, your own exhausted sense of what's actually possible, the moment those two things stop pointing in the same direction. And most of us, when we make that choice, tell ourselves the story Marmont told himself. It was already over. I was protecting something. The thing I ended couldn't have survived anyway. I just acknowledged reality a little earlier than everyone else was willing to. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes the war really is lost, and the only honest act is to stop feeding men into it. Sometimes the person you're loyal to is in fact asking for something that will destroy you both. But here's the quiet thing. The thing Marmont's memoirs couldn't resolve and his long life couldn't dissolve. You don't get to know in the moment which kind of betrayal yours is. You don't get the luxury of historical perspective at the point of decision. You only get the dark and the choice and the long life afterward, where you'll spend considerable energy explaining to yourself and everyone else why it was the right one. Napoleon knew this. That's why he shook the hand. Not because he forgave it, because he recognized it. Because he had asked for superhuman things from human men for 13 years, and some part of him had always known that the bill would come due in exactly this currency. Let the room settle around you now. Outside, somewhere, the same stars that hung over Fontainebleau in April 1814 are still up there, rearranged slightly by 2 centuries of Earth's turning, but the same ancient light. Napoleon sat under them in his final weeks at that palace, walking the gardens at strange hours, talking to whichever aide had the stamina to keep up. By most accounts, he was calm. Quieter than anyone expected. He had already moved, it seems, past the anger and into something that looked almost like curiosity. What does an empire feel like from the outside? What does a life look like when the machinery stops? He would find out. 30 days later, he would be on a ship to Elba, and a year after that, he would be back, and 100 days after that would come Waterloo and then St. Helena, and 6 years of island exile and slow death. But in those last April days at Fontainebleau, before all of that, he sat at a table with the man who ended his last hope, and he passed the wine, and he smiled. Some things are too large for anger. Some things you can only witness. Let your breath slow. Let your body remember it's safe. Here, in this quiet room, the betrayals of empires are very far away tonight. History is a long story, and you are somewhere in the middle of it, and right now your only job is to rest. Thank you for being here with Echoes of History tonight. If this story stayed with you, a like means more than you might think. It's how other restless minds find their way to this channel. Leave a comment before you sleep. Where are you? What time is it? What question is this story leaving in you? I read every one, and I'm always glad to know who's out there. Channel membership is open if you ever want to go deeper. It's a quiet room and there's no pressure. Subscribe if you haven't. Come back whenever the night gets long. We are all inheritors of someone else's empire. Someone else's ambitions, someone else's collapses, the long echo of choices made before we arrived. Tonight, you rest inside that echo. Sleep well. The story keeps.